collecting. I hope everybody's having a good day so far, staying safe. Brother James,
What's up, Badir?
how you doing, man?
I'm doing all right. How you doing?
Doing pretty good, man. Took a nice little nap, and just waiting for things to calm down and get some good grub and just take it easy. How about you, man? How's the day so far? How's the quarantine life treating you?
I'm all right, man. Ramadan Mubarak, right?
Ramadan Mubarak, brother.
What we're all learning is that, that Islam has known a lot of this for a long time. You got to regularly wash your hands. You got to, cover up portions of your head. You got to, get your diet together. You got to get stuff figured out.
Yes,
the reasons why we have these practices. So I hope you're holding up all right.
Yeah, I am. One of my main things is just getting enough sleep, changing my sleep hours and sleep habits. I'm a night owl, so a lot of times I'm usually up late at night working. I know a lot of people that follow me see my late night rants, and posts and stuff like that, to where I'm usually just going all types of crazy. But I also find that, a great time, especially during this time, to actually work. The phone's not going off. Nobody's really liking or commenting on Instagram photos. So you have a chance to just really relate and fall back and just work on what you have to work on. So I really appreciate that off time. But yeah, man, I want to thank you so much for having me. I mean, for coming on here. I'm sorry, but for being on, and just being able to share your wisdom, knowledge, and experience. We've had some great, pre-talks about everything regarding museums, the future, how things look. Just a little prehistory. I met James at MoAD San Francisco, which is a great institution. And I was part of a talk with artist curator Phoenix, Yes Universe, and also Antoine Sargent, and his name was Kamal.
Mark Sapp.
Mark Sapp, and who was the guy Kamal? Kamal, he was remember he did the he ran the digital almost like a music like Napster for digital. Remember, he was on the panel with us as well. It was I can't remember Kamal Herbert.
Right.
Yeah, he was a real good dude. So they were running a really cool exhibition called Digitalia. Was really amazing, and I got a chance to meet James and the crew, and we've been great buddies ever since. We've seen each other at fairs, and I've just loved the work that he's been doing and the experience that he has and the knowledge that he gives off, and just want to thank him for being with us today. So James, if you don't mind, give the folks a little background on who you are and what you do.
Sure, happy to. I've spent most all of my life working in museums. Like you said, that's how we met each other. My last stop was as deputy director and director of development for MoAD in San Francisco, where I was there for a little over 2 years. And other than that, I grew up in Maryland, and first job working at the Baltimore Museum of Art in high school as a teaching intern. And eventually went to NYU undergraduate, worked at the Metropolitan Museum for a little over 8 years, doing a bunch of things, researcher in the Department of European Paintings, where I worked for Dr. Andrea Bayer, and eventually then moving into the development department, where I was for a little over 6 years. And then out here in California, I've worked at about 5 or 6 different museums in Northern California and the Bay Area. A place called the Magnas, which is now part of the University of California, Berkeley, Contemporary Jewish Museum, San Jose Museum of Art, and a couple of other stops along the way. So primarily focused on fundraising, but my background and training is in art history. And a lot of the work that I do is very much about engaging communities and working hard to make sure that the work that we're making and creating in museums is serving a higher social purpose.
Most definitely. So tapping from the early days and kind of getting into it, what drove your interest to become a museum professional?
Really good question. I think, in a lot of ways, it had to do with the fact that I was making art myself. One of the other things is I'm also an artist. I trained as a studio artist at NYU. And that's how I met my wife. And in a lot of ways, a lot of how it started was just that I was going to museums because it was where I was taking the source material for the drawings and paintings that I was doing. And I'd also say in a lot of ways that I was encouraged by my parents when I was growing up in Maryland. We were right near the Smithsonian. So in a lot of ways, the greatest thing we could ever do was when we would head off to the Smithsonian. And then with that, National Gallery became a really important place for me. When I was very young, the East Wing had just opened, the I.M. Pei designed building. So there was also a lot of strong interest in thinking about contemporary art as we were looking at what was happening in the East Wing of the National Gallery when I was a little kid. So then with that, I've been lucky enough to sort of, stay in the hustle and keep working in museums. So it's ended up being the way that I've made my living for all of my life.
Nice, nice. So for folks not too familiar, with the, museum process, deputy director is a pretty important position. Can you explain, just to give folks some context, what a deputy director does? What are the primary responsibilities of, a deputy director?
Interesting question. I think it depends a little bit on the institution, but in a lot of ways, the deputy director is the person who in many cases is helping to refine strategy. Once sort of the board and the director have established a tone and a strategy, often the deputy director helps articulate that strategy and also helps execute on that strategy. A lot of what I was also doing when I was there as deputy director is I also stepped in as interim director for about 9 months when I was at MoAD. And that's also happened to me in a couple of other institutions. It was the same at the CJM and for periods of time at the Magnas. So that typically also for institutions that have a deputy director, it often ends up being the person who steps in to the director role when the director either leaves and or in other instances when the director's out of town.
Yep. Nice, nice. So as we start to break into a little bit of the conversation, one of the things that we've talked about and a lot of folks have, asked me through, social media stories and things like that is why museums now? When folks have the opportunity to display their own works on their own feeds and have the same almost level field as the same museums, they're on the same platforms, they're distributing to, or they have the opportunity to distribute to the same audiences. Why museums now?
Also, a really great question. And it's, for me, if there is no real reason for museums. It's one of the things that in many ways I worry when museums start to take themselves for granted, right? I feel like in the work that I do in museums, having worked in museums my entire life, museums have to validate themselves every minute of their existence, right? So that they should know that, like, as you're asking and that you're saying that other people are asking, people want to say, why should we have museums, right? So at the same time, one of the things that I think is also a challenge is that I feel like one of the things that's so special about museums is that these have become really integral parts of the human experience. For better or for worse, because I actually kind of feel like they become an integral part of the human experience because there are other things that were much more sort of innate to how we designed ourselves and how we gathered and how we came together, right? When we first started the call, we were talking about Ramadan, right? Yes. We were talking about religious gatherings. We were talking about how people come together in religious spaces, right? Typically also, people would remain together even in their nuclear space, right? Like, it's kind of funny now that we're all sort of, sheltering at home. Not to say that it's funny, but it's unusual. In earlier times, the families stuck together for longer and more extended periods of time. And with that, we're able to continue to convey their stories. The other things that sort of held culture together. In a lot of ways, I kind of feel like in the late 20th century and now into the 21st, we ended up creating museums. Museums ended up being created in a way primarily to assert empire. A lot of what was happening was either displaying the royal collections to a populace,
Mm-hmm.
or by way of showing those materials that had been claimed through empire, you know, in terms of like, you know, the collections that are in Paris having been taken from West Africa, or those kinds of spaces, or even to think about, you know, like the railroad barons or coal barons who end up building up a lot of the museums that are right now celebrating their 150th or 125th anniversary. For a lot of them, it was about a sort of assertion of capital. We can prove that we have as much money as the rich people of Europe and what they're buying, and then we can display it to other people so that we can display that we're part of this process of amassing capital. I think in a lot of ways, that's how museums came together, but more also the role that they now play, I feel like has ended up playing a real central role for human society across the globe as being the managers of history, the storytellers, the conveners, the entertainers, the educators. More also, it's one of the greatest problems in the United States of America, which is that we have way underinvested in public education. And the net result is that as a country, we've moved toward informal education, making up the difference. And museums play a really critical role there. There are a lot of communities, larger and smaller, where almost the only art that that kids are getting access to is actually art that's being provided through like an informal delivery of education procedures through or process, you know, or something through a museum. So for me, in a lot of ways, I feel like museums have become essential. If you have somebody who's saying to you as an artist or otherwise, why do I have to show at a museum? The answer should be really, you don't have to, you know, get that hustle, figure out where you need to. If a museum can be helpful for you, then think about that trajectory as well. But I'm not trying to suggest that it's necessary, nor should museums serve as gatekeepers, nor should museums serve as, you know, the sort of ultimate validation in some way for either the quality or the value of a work of art.
Very true. I totally agree to that. And it kind of brings me, brings the start of our conversation in a nice, good segue, because, you know, one of the things that we've talked about before is about, you know, museum collections. And one article I read today in the Washington Post, you know, when they were talking about more museums now have the green light to sell their art. You know, so I'm wondering, you know, as a museum professional, or even, you know, as an arts professional like myself, you know, we talk about those stories, you know, those stories of these families, you know, do those stories now become owned by the private collector and now are not, I guess, removed from the public consumption, you know, because when those stories have a place like a museum or have a space on view, you're able to not only see those stories, but you're able to get publications, you're able to get more information and dig deeper if you want to. When those works are deaccessioned and go into private collections, do you think those stories go with it?
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. And I think, you know, that's a big issue in terms of, you know, where the art itself lives. And then with that, you know, and who best it serves. Right. But I also feel like for me, in a lot of ways, the thing that's odd about museums is that at least from my perspective, I feel like there aren't actually a set of legal rules that manage and maintain what a museum is.
Yes.
Right. To the best of my knowledge, having worked in museums my whole life, having an MBA with a minor in museum studies, as well as done additional master's work in study of museums, there's really almost only one law that oversees museums, which is that they must have education as a defining element of the work that they do, and being educational entities, for people to make outright contributions to that organization, people can receive a certain form of tax deduction. And for the most part, except for other things about liability and certain kind of human resources issues that go with businesses, other than that, there really isn't any law that truly like oversees the work that has to do with museums. So in many ways, what it's more about is like a code of ethics and an understanding that's managed by a group of almost kind of like overseers. Right? Like all of this starts to lead into these questions when people ask about who controls museums, who owns them. Right now, we're running into massive issues around layoffs, around frontline staff, and how that's drastically affecting people of color, right? So, but indeed, as a matter of fact, what's mainly been ruling museums, as you're reading in the in that Washington Post article, for example, is the Association of Art Museum Directors.
Yep. The
right.
AAMD,
so,
yep.
Right. So you know a certain amount about the demographics of the people in that room. It's predominantly white male driven, and it also predominantly is coming from a place where many of those people have, you know, several degrees and otherwise, and come from a certain kind of place of privilege. So indeed, it's actually through those kind of almost governing bodies of sort. But as a matter of fact, they don't really have any power other than allowing that organization or professionals in that organization to join their group or otherwise, right? They have the ability to like censure. They can say like, we really wish you wouldn't do that, right? But there's nothing that actually keeps a museum from selling its collection other than like an understood code of ethics. So I think that's also one of the things that's important, because what starts to happen is when we move into these times where museums are now running into major problems, all of the things that seem to be managing and controlling them start to fall apart in a way, because really it's all being managed by a sort of code of ethics and quite literally gentlemen's agreements that like, this is how we do it.
So do you think, with that being said, like would a pandemic, you know, cause for a interruption or a change in those ethics? Like, let's say for instance, someone goes on hard times and they know they have a loan to a certain museum, and you know, does a pandemic give, or a pandemic or something that grows into an epidemic? I'm not, you know, trying to wish anything, but just looking at the future because it's unknown. Would something like that, or the length of something like that, you know, would that be a reason for someone to say, you know what, I'd like to pull my art out here and put it up for sale? Or for a museum to say, you know what, we can remove this because we need cash on hand to actually keep us afloat? Would a pandemic be a perfect time to kind of go away from those code of ethics? Because there's no real, you know, like you said, there's no real structure, there's no real rules that say you cannot do that. So ethically, you know, people are losing their jobs, they're losing their homes, they're losing all of this stuff. So being able to tap into a potential resource that could bring liquidity, you know, would this be a time to where that code of ethics would be waived?
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, and that's part of the message in this Washington Post article. I think it was just recently put out by Sebastian Smee, who's been doing a lot of good writing during this period of time, not only about a lot of the organizational issues, but a lot of aesthetic issues. He's been doing some really interesting pieces for the Washington Post, detailing certain pieces, say, from National Gallery, or I think he also spends a lot of time in Boston. So he's been writing a fair amount about pieces from the MFA Boston. And in that, in the organizational piece, he says how the Association of Art Museum Directors is loosening their restrictions, allowing museums to think about selling works. The real managing and determining factor in a lot of that, which is an interesting thing to consider, is the curator.
Yeah.
Right. And I think what's also interesting to think about is, you know, whenever I tell somebody I work in a museum, they say, oh, you must be a curator, because in a way it's like the only like professional position known to people outside of the museum world, in a way. Right. And so part of that is also because curators play a really, really critical role. And one of the things that they do, and I imagine you may have heard this before, but it's one of my it's one of my sort of favorite things in terms of thinking about museums, is where does that word curate come from, right? And its background is really religious. Its background is are the figures who were the curare, who were the people who cared for the congregants that were sort of in their fold. It continues on in this kind of, Christian shepherd kind of metaphor. They're sort of the shepherds of the flock in a sense.
Yep.
And they make sure that the congregation is cared for. And then indeed, actually, I think the roots of the term curate and to care are the same.
Are the same, yep.
Right. And so that then now, as that term ends up getting applied to the managing of fine art or otherwise collections, the idea is really in a way that they are caring for souls, that they are in a way managing the flock or caring for the flock. With that, there's a real sense, I think, of being focused on what you were talking about like the stories that go along with objects, right? Yeah. That's where you're trusting the instinct, training, and empathy of that curator figure to make a recommendation, to say, this is the one that we could sell, where if this story went over here, we could still keep this story, and we'd be able to manage that story. And in a lot of ways, their lifetime commitment is to make sure that the relationship and stories, content, meaning, and significance of those objects in relation to the communities they serve, as well as in relation to the institutions where they exist, all remain in some way intact.
So with that being said, like, being that, smaller museums would have a tougher time navigating financials or collection or whatever it is during, the pandemic that we're going through now, would it be along the line of those code of ethics if museums only sold to museums, if they weren't putting pieces up to auction? But let's say if, a smaller museum had to sell off, one of their top 10 works to a MoMA, to get a $10 million, $15 million, appraisal, of course, saying that you have to pay primary market prices, so that they can fill their endowment to be able to keep operating costs, everything going. Would that, be allowing those code of ethics? And do you think that would matter? Do you think that would, help to stimulate things, or would it just be the rich getting richer?
I think I think you raise a set of really of interesting questions about the opportunities for organizations to be able to like collaborate or help other organizations on a certain kind of scale, right? I think what you're suggesting makes a lot of sense. I'm not quite sure that there's really, well, there are some precedents for that in a way, but I think what most organizations really try and do is to look at establishing partnerships, and I think, ways for us to think about how do we manage this moving forward, because also, like, this isn't going to end soon, so like, what about the next thing? Are there other ways that we can come up for solutions to sort of help smaller to medium-sized organizations like you're suggesting? I think we need to be exploring all of them. And I do think that some larger organizations, my understanding, I think, for example, the Getty down in LA has established a $10 million fund as the Getty itself, because it also serves as a foundation
it does a
to
lot.
be going back to support artists and art institutions in LA. Right? And I think we need to be looking at how do organizations take different approaches to either be able to help other institutions in their area or to better support the artists that they serve, right? So, for
did we lose James a little bit?
Can you hear me?
Yep, I see you now. You're back.
Right on. So, like, for example, you mentioned MoAD. MoAD right now, in the interest of trying to help the museum, has an online auction going that's still going to be up, I think, for another week or so, or another few days into next week. It's a really nice opportunity for the museum in that instance to be able to raise the profile of some artists. Some artists who are involved in it are already have strong reputations and good followings. This provides an opportunity for other artists to be involved in that way. Right. I think there's some other opportunities where organizations are thinking about, like, how do they want to take this moment to think about reaching out to other organizations and to be working with them. And there's also been a lot of, at some point, I'd love to go over some other sort of resources and other people who've been publishing around the activity of what's happening in museums. Because indeed, for better or for worse, some of the frontline stuff that we're hearing about is instead about the number of layoffs happening at MoMA New York, for its
Mm-hmm.
frontline educators, or some of those other issues where I think we really need to think about how do institutions really think about their long-term relationship with communities and shore up their
Mm-hmm.
existing resources. But it's also difficult because we really just don't know how long this is going to practically last, right?
Yeah. So like with that being said, like, the communities that would usually visit museums are now, like we talked about earlier, they're now at home.
Right,
So these museums, a lot of museums are not digitally enabled yet. What I loved about MoAD when you guys were, doing the exhibition that I got to speak at, is that you guys were, trying new things, digital, it was all types of new curators, new talks,
right,
bringing in folks that,
right.
would bring not only, education, but also ideas, so how can the museums implement what their programming is if they're not already digitally, I guess, sound, if they don't have a base in digital already? How can they start to add that to their business plan? Because a lot of these museums, unlike the MoMA, the Met, who have digital collections, the Jewish Museum has a great collection as well. I think GFA was working with them
Yeah.
social media wise, and like they have a great way that they display their collection online. It's just amazing. But what about when we talk about those small museums? How do they implement, without having the finances to really overhaul, their whole digital experience? How do they compete, in reaching those communities?
Well, I mean, again, a really good question. I think it's also foundational to where we're at right now. Um,
Mm-hmm.
I feel like there's probably no museum right now that doesn't have some kind of digital approach, right?
Yeah.
It just not least of which a web page, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
because at this point, the internet has replaced the phone book. So, if you need to be able to be
Mm-hmm.
found, you need to have a web page, right? So
Yep.
that's a starting point. And I think almost every museum in America likely has some kind of web page. And if they don't have their own web page, then they're partnered with, whatever is the local typical
Yeah.
lookup, Yelp or otherwise, right? More also, as we move to not only the sort of, massive distribution of digital access, but most particularly in terms of thinking about handheld technology, right? I mean, you can start doing a Facebook Live or anything like that you want to be doing simply with it just being held in your hand,
Yeah.
So I think actually more particularly, I think everybody has a digital strategy. The
Mm-hmm.
question is it strategic? Is it measured? Is it also
Mm-hmm.
really thinking about and observing who's on the other side and understanding how you want to possibly either segment your approaches or think about different ways that you're messaging to better engage, and really also with that to make sure that when you're pushing out your message, that you're at that same time somehow creating spaces where your audience is able to feel like they are
Mm-hmm.
participating, because
Yeah.
not only is that what's expected nowadays, but like way back since time immemorial, that's what people have always liked. I mean, it's not just
Yeah.
a matter of being with the storyteller, but it's that experience of being in the communal space, being in the place together, whether there's a fire pit, whether there are other pieces. This idea that, we want to participate is innately human. And I think it's good that our technology has gotten to a place now where that participatory element is really in many ways baked into the cake at this point.
Yeah.
Present conversation, case in point.
Yeah, most definitely. And like I thought about it, and I talked a little bit about this with Kenny Schachter, and we were talking even offline about, what happens when people start getting comfortable with getting this content delivered straight to them,
Right,
and realize like, hey, I'm totally fine with seeing Picasso on my couch. I don't
right.
need to go to MoMA, and the MoMA's attendance declines, or that smaller museum's attendance declines because that museum's done digital so well that they're also now hurting their physical, market share. Um,
Yeah.
like, has museums, or as being a museum professional, do you think they're thinking about that, to where adding more to one is ultimately going to take away from the other? Because if you're driving more, let's say if we're estimating out the museum experience to be in digital, completely digital for the next 6 months, and museums have budgets, they have things they have to spend because these things still go on, and they say, you know what, our budget is best spent, you know, making sure that folks can access these rooms that we're talking about here, these digital spaces. The community can actually access these rooms. They can communicate with them. They can take something away from them. They have programming online to where we're delivering different content, to where now they don't have the operating, or now they're thinking of laying off people because now the numbers are a little fudged because one part of the company, or the museum, I'm sorry, doesn't look like it's necessary because, yeah, the physical has been closed for 6 months. So do you
Right.
think that there is an opportunity for there to be a misrepresentation of what's important, or the mission? You know, I don't know if I'm phrasing that question right, but, you know, being a misrepresentation, having this time being a misrepresentation of the business model of certain museums.
You know, really well phrased, I think, in terms of, especially as you're moving, in terms of thinking about like how we're framed as museums. In a lot of ways, you know, I think I'm older than being like a digital native per se, right? I mean, I guess also, like, you know, it didn't exist until at some point, primarily as computers come in, and given my age, it's primarily around like middle school and high school. But you know, my general sense is that I think that the embrace of digital is something that that, you know, we're all in the middle of. I mean, you know, it's why our elections are what they are. Amongst other things, you know. So, and I feel like there are a lot of folks who have been very focused on looking at the work that's happening in digital in museums. I was just part of the Museums and the Web conference that was just a couple of weeks ago, and just a few weeks coming down the line, the Museum Computer Network, where there's a whole host of people who are exploring the meaningful engagement of digital in museum spaces, for collection management, for audience engagement, for you know, for distribution and otherwise. It practically has become part of our reality, right? And definitely this moment has driven home for a lot of our institutions that if you didn't have a thoroughly thought out strategic articulation of what you were doing in the digital spaces, then you need to really make sure that you're setting all of that up. Some organizations already had that. Cleveland Museum of Art is incredibly sophisticated in the work that they're doing. And SF MoMA as well has been doing some very sophisticated work for a long period of time. And also a willingness to try and sort of, you know, fail fast and move forward and do all those kinds of things that define Silicon Valley in a way. Good example would be the success at SF MoMA when Jay Mollica and a team helped develop this, you know, text to the museum. Did you have a chance to ever play with that? When you could text SF MoMA, right? And they'd send you back pieces from the collection with a note. Super cool, hugely successful, probably one of the most successful audience engagement initiatives and meaningful audience engagement initiatives that I've ever seen in any museum. And indeed, it was part of an overarching strategy. It's worth knowing that it was recently put to bed. It was quite specifically, somewhat with a strategy in mind, decided that that would no longer be going. And I think now there's this question that indeed a lot of the museums have shut down, and the frontline staff now is the digital team, right? So the question is, who's on that team? How is it being managed? And then there are other questions about how do you divide up the technical team that actually really needs to be focused on infrastructure, laptops and PCs on people's desktops, and then the other team that's about the social engagement. And does that reside under education? Does that reside under marketing? Or is it wholly independent unto itself as a particular group that can sort of pull together all of the different silos and get one message out on behalf of the organization? There are a couple of different approaches. And there's some interesting people who I think are leading in that space. A really smart a guy, Douglas Hegley, at the Indianapolis Museum of Art. Also, some of the work that's happening at the Philbrook Museum in Tulsa, Oklahoma. where in that
Yeah.
case, they're really trying to do a really fine mix of real-time, real life engagement and online engagement. A nice example is the museum is notorious for having a large garden and a lot of cats that live in that garden. So they've also been putting up portraits of the cats, encouraging people all over the world to then write messages to the cats.
Messages, yeah.
And they're getting letters so that people are actually then going back, actual, sort of carbon-based activity of writing a letter. It goes to the museum. And then they also set up a way in which the cats are actually replying to all of those as well. So it's sort of a nice mix of all of the layers of engagement. And a part of it is really an understanding that digitally you can observe what those cats are doing. And then all of these other real world activities that happen around it. So, I think it's an essential question. And more also, I kind of feel like, none of us have any idea what's happening right now and where this is going to go, right? Like, is it going to be like this in July? Is it going to be like this in December? Sort of one of the clearest messages I've seen from any museum is the Perez Museum of Art that has been very clear. They're now aiming for September. This is what they're doing. They've also recently recruited a super, super smart theorist around online engagement, a woman named Heidi Quicksilver, who had been at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and running their social media piece. She's now moved down to the Perez. So I definitely keep an eye on what they're doing. I think everybody's keeping an eye on what Franklin Sermons is doing, the director of the Perez, for
he does
a lot of reasons.
Yeah.
And he's really also trying to sort of say, like, here's how I feel like it's going to go. We're not doing anything till September. And then starting to think about how do we engage people. And really, I think, whether it's digital or real time, everything is going to be different as things start to open back up, right? Yeah. Germany is starting to open its museums back up. But what's happening is what we're hearing is that people's primary concern is safety and security, right? Yep. So it means that, like, we have to have gloves in the front. People may need to get gloves themselves. Everybody will need masks. There needs to be a physical distancing of the 6 to 8 feet. And, the question is also, is transmission going to be something that's going to be now an ongoing concern for all of us, right? Like, and already we're changing as a humanity across the globe, right? We're not shaking hands anymore, right? We've been shaking hands for what? 300 years or something, right? There's always a history to these things too. It was probably something about some way that you would, like, arrive and show that you didn't have a firearm or something. That you, like, reach out and show that your right hand was empty. There's always a reason. So whatever's coming up now during this COVID time where we're, like, bumping elbows or, like, doing the kid and play, which is what my son and I do with each other, that kind of stuff is going to become a new normal. So as you're asking, I kind of feel like we don't know exactly how we're going to be entering those new spaces, but digital is definitely going to be a part of it.
One thing I thought about, and adding on, and I think you touched on, really eloquently on a few of these points that I'm going to go at is, how much of the museum, the future museum, will be automated. There's a lot of new arts brands and arts companies that have been developing that, do AR, VR, that do... a lot of different materials that do collection management, that do all of this stuff to where museums might say, it could be easier, cost effective and everything for us to have an outside, a third party entity take care of this aspect so that we can free up some money and focus on that. How much of that automation do you think will take hold? I even heard, like, I was reading, I forgot which article it was, I'll find it again, where they talked about, and when you mentioned the Philbrook having that garden, I thought about this too. The museum being almost like a mausoleum, where you're just walking through and there's just art pieces in glass, and just, they're just all around wherever. It's just like a national park, and people are walking around in open, in open space. And there's just museum might own the land that the, museum or whatever, however it goes. But, kind of like a shopping mall. I don't know if you've been to the thing they call the shawarma. I've sort of called it the shawarma in New York. I forgot what it's called. But
let's leave it at shawarma. I haven't seen it in person, but I've seen lots of pictures, right?
But those type of, like, shopping mall type of entities where, being that art has become like this commodity and, finance, thing where people want to just see luxury around them shopping or around them just moving around, to where it goes into a different space. Do you see the art world or museum world completely automating itself, or a big percentage of itself going forward?
Well, it's interesting. I think you bring up a couple of different points. One of the things that you were talking about, how, like, in terms of trying to outsource some of what's being done with technology, then also talking about, in terms of thinking about augmented reality or artificial intelligence happening in those spaces. And then also suggesting, in a way, that if some of that work were happening, would it be a way that the museum could be saving money? And then getting a little bit into this question about, is there like a space that sort of has less controls around it and can be just basically sort of, wandered around and experienced? Exactly.
Yep.
And so for me, in a lot of ways, it brings up a whole different sort of set of like responses and themes. One of the things is that that very early on, in an embrace of technology, and this for me is probably about 20 plus years ago or so, and some of the work when I was at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and it was a time at which, maybe a little bit longer ago than that, where, like, really in a lot of ways, like, the internet is just getting started. I mean, when I first started in the development office, it was actually a time at which the museum was deciding, like, did there need to be a PC on everybody's desktop?
Wow.
We were in a world where Bill Gates was telling us there needed to be a PC on everybody's desktop, but the museum itself was still suspicious of whether there needed to be a PC on everybody's laptop, right? Within pretty short order, the internet is coming along, and we're starting to look further at technology. What we learned as a field at that time is that to come up with a technological solution is almost never less money. It's invariably more money. And then also, even if you're going to outsource the development, you still need to really make sure that the internal caretakers and other people are deeply involved in the whole process and how it rolls out. So I'm just saying, like, as it relates to doing that, right? At the same time, I actually kind of feel like, the museum that you're envisioning or describing into the future, a lot of us have seen already, right? Like we were just looking at this exhibition or installation a little over 2 years ago at MoAD called Digitalia, where we had all of the pieces could only be viewed properly through your phone and through augmented reality. Right. Following that, Mark Sabb and the team there went on to design interpretive educational materials for a later exhibition called Coffee, Rum, Sugar, and Gold, curated by Larry Osei-Mensah, Dexter Wimberly, and Emily Coleman. And in the galleries, we had augmented reality going on all of the pieces.
Nice.
There was a really, really terrific installation that was overseen in some way, in part, by a guy named Seb Chan, that was installed at the Cooper Hewitt Museum in New York when the Cooper Hewitt reopened. And there were a bunch of really neat things that you could do where they had designed like a informational pen where you could go around and select different objects and collect information and create like a digital gallery that you'd be able to access elsewhere and augment and move forward. More particularly, though, what they had created, the Cooper Hewitt is a center for design. So, so like in a lot of ways, what people will want to do is look at patterns, learn from patterns. What was it that Escher designed? What did William Morris do? How do you copy those? Mary Mecco. As you look at new designs, most designers like to look at historical designs and otherwise, and it's why a lot of our design museums exist, most especially the Cooper Hewitt. And when it was reopened, they had this super, super cool installation where instead of going to look at wallpaper samples, which you could do in certain galleries, they also had another gallery set up where you could design your own wallpaper. And in the process of doing it, you do it all online, pull in some patterns and do other things. It would then wallpaper the entire room through a projection and digital screen, so that then you would understand how that wallpaper fills spaces, what the implications of design are, what happens when a small particular design gets replicated across a large field, what are the visual implications. It was brilliant. So indeed, a lot of that work already exists. So the question is, in our now or new normal, how do we want to think more thoroughly around that, especially if during this period of time, exactly as you're saying, every museum has been forced to prioritize their strategy around digital engagement for the communities that they serve. And then that itself comes with a whole host of other kind of issues in terms of, who's being served. Do all of those people have access to Wi-Fi? Is all of mobile enabled? So that if indeed in certain communities where it's really more about the phone than the laptop or anything else, are we really thinking about how people are accessing and stuff like that? On the other part that you were asking about like, does it become like the shawarma? Is it defined by retail? I love that question because I feel like in a lot of ways, what has become a regular parlance in a way as a people is how do we move retail spaces, right? Like what we know are stores and malls. They too have in a place kind of replaced our churches and other places where we convene. In classic old Greek society, it was the agora, right? It was the place where the store was, right? Where people would come together. Through the Silk Roads, right? Like what everybody knows is when the central square was the place where everybody would do their trade and otherwise, that's the place where people would convene. That's how you passed messages back and forth across China and the Middle East and otherwise during that period of time. So there's an ancient kind of human precedent for sort of moving through retail spaces together. I think it defines a lot of what we do now. And again, I kind of feel like we already have a lot of that, I mean, I think that before I'd left New York 18 years ago or so, the Met had just started to make it common practice that the final gallery of any special exhibition would always be the gift shop. Right? And they'd actually move it around and create little tiny gift shops at the end of each one, right? All coming back around to this, Banksy special documentary, right? Exit through the gift shop, which is what museums have very much come about. One of my favorite, so I just think you're right on the money. And I actually think that moving forward, exactly as you're suggesting, there are likely two strong things. One of which is going to be a real focus on digital engagement. The other is going to be really sort of doubling down on museums as being places for contemplation and reverie, where you're just simply there to commune, to convene, right? I mean, I was working in the Metropolitan Museum during 9/11. I remember the morning sort of heading up to be in the executive wings where we had just installed these fancy brand new flat screens and indeed actually watching the second plane hit. Wow. What the museum did in direct response, I think we were closed the next day. The next day was just mayhem. And nobody knew what to do. I think the day after that, the museum was back open. And it was part of this whole program by the then very well-respected mayor of New York, a man named Rudy Giuliani, right? And in terms of saying, like, let's get back to business, right? And what was the first thing he said is he said, go shopping, right? And I remember being in New York at that time and taking that as like a real sort of, message to say, let's shop, Having said that, I think what we're hearing now from a lot of our leaders, a lot of our community leaders, a lot of us, is let's stop shopping. Please, let's take this moment to see what we can do to really be thoughtful moving forward, to engage people behind this thoughtfulness, to go slow, to not emphasize growth, to not believe that like we can exist on the next donor we haven't met yet, that there's always going to be somebody who's going to come to save us. And more also, we really need to be thinking about the having the most significant local impact possible, connecting with people on the ground, hands-on art making, and creating a space where people feel supported, safe, secure, and to then be contemplative, right? The places that we used to do through religion, family, or otherwise, and create those kind of spaces for our museums. And indeed, that's the model that the big shawarma is based on anyway, right? I mean, they wish that it was some kind of like totem or some kind of place. I mean, what they want is they wanted to make a pilgrimage. They want it to become like, they want it to be the kind of thing that people would go to and then circle around in a certain kind of pattern, right? Ever heard of something like that before? But it's lacking the spirituality and the contemplative nature that museums and their collections provoke.
Most definitely. So like even you make some great points, and I was thinking about like, with the museums, you know, being, you know, that house that housed the stories, as we talked about in the beginning, and, you know, them being able to reach out to communities with these stories, and, you know, having the donors to be able to provide some of the financial vehicles to
Yeah.
fund these projects. You know, with the museum not being a physical space anymore, how do you think these donors feel about, you know, bequeathing collections, you know, or, you know, doing certain amounts of money, you know, if a museum says, you know, our budget is 25% lower this year because we focused more on digital, it did better for us. So now does the donor give, you know, not their, you know, ordinary, let's say if they gave $1 million a year, do they now give 750,000? Does, you know, how does, you know, I guess the charitable giving of change, you know, during something like this, or how would you see something like that changing?
Well, you know, I mean, again, I think it has to come back around to making sure that museums are indeed meaningfully embedded within the communities that they serve.
Yep.
Right. And that can mean a lot of different things, right? You know, like I found myself, like, you know, tweeting with somebody today, and I have to tell you, like, if for those who are working in museums or wanting to work more in museums, there's been some terrific dialogue and explorations and sharing going on in the Twitter space. There always is, but right now it's just been particularly kind of evocative for me, and I've really been enjoying it. Some really smart conversations. There's a man who I really like and admire. He works at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. I don't know exactly what he does, because we've actually yet to run into each other in a real space or at a conference or otherwise. But we've been trading notes with each other for what feels like at least 7 years or so. And we got into an exchange this morning that was about, you know, sort of community served and otherwise. And it strikes me, you know, having worked at the Metropolitan for a while, if you want to talk about community served, you know, the people who are supporting the Met live right across the street. You know, I mean, they're actually, however much you want to, you know, some organizations may accuse them of sort of, you know, not serving their communities. They're serving their communities. The community is right there, and they are across the street. And in many cases, their name is Trump, Mnuchin, Koch, right? I mean, that these are the people that are supporting them, that are investing in them, and they need to be mindful and thoughtful about how they engage those donors. So, you know, for me, in a lot of ways, I feel like we're on something of a holding pattern right now. But I think in the very near future, I think that depending on how negatively impacted we are across the board as a country, I think there's a certain amount of philanthropy that will continue. I think it's important that, at least from my perspective, in a lot of ways, to talk about like cutting costs and containing costs doesn't really make for a very compelling case for fundraising. Just because you were saying, like, you know, if we do this and contain our costs, will you think about donating? I think that it really needs to be about the purpose and about the mission and making sure that you're connecting with people. With that, people will continue to donate and people will continue to give, unless, which is not unlikely, profound structural changes start to happen in this country. And also, indeed, I mean, the head of the American Alliance of Museums, one of these professional organizations that helps maintain a code of ethics for the industry, has said that they think that there's a strong chance that a third of the museums in this country may go out of business following this pandemic. Right. So, so more also to a certain degree, I mean, I think it becomes a careful question for museums in terms of thinking about how actively do they keep fundraising and making sure that their, you know, purpose remains valid and strong and that they have a long-term plan for remaining meaningful. And a big part of that is the staff. I mean, so I also feel like, which a lot of people have been saying, that with the layoffs, partly why that's so difficult is that the publics and certain members in museums might see them as being, in a way, sort of, you know, something else that serves publics and otherwise. But you ask any good business person, what's the most important aspect of their business? And they'll tell you it's the talent. Right? And part of the challenge of the museum world is that we have a lot of people who are running museums who don't have business backgrounds. And in many ways, in many cases, don't sort of see it from a business perspective. And having worked for a long time in museums, I'll also tell you that for better or for worse, for some reason, as board members who really drive a lot of what happens at museums, everything they know about how to run their businesses is not the same skills that they bring to the board table. And I don't know why. They make fundamental mistakes that they would never make in their own businesses, right? Like, for example, not to be too negative about it, right? But you are like, what if we come back to these groups and say we did everything digital so it cost us less money? That's never the case. Digital always costs twice as much money, right? Yeah. But you're not a board member, right? Yeah. Like if you were somebody coming in from any given technology company, you would say, we need a new technology initiative, so let's build a task force, let's do this, let's double down investments, let's figure out what it's going to be, and in the long run, and put more money in it. For some reason, often many of those same people will show up at a board meeting for a cultural nonprofit and say, let's just do it digital. Shouldn't it cost us less money? And like, wait a second, what happened to the hat you were just wearing at your like noon presentation? Yeah, and the for-profit side of the brain. Exactly. It's just, I think it's an interesting set of questions. And, you know, in a lot of ways, the definition of the work that I've needed to do most of my life has been about embracing optimism. Yeah. A lot of what I do is about raising money for organizations. And a lot of that is really just based on a faith. That if we're doing the right work, the resources will come. And if you do that well, you can bring other people with you. Yep. And that's the essential component to a lot of that work. And with that in mind, I'm just not in a place where I could say, oh, well, people won't invest. The very nature of the work that I do is to just believe that people will. And indeed, I worked at museums across 9/11. During the financial crash of 2008, I raised more money in a year than I've raised in my whole professional life, some $16 million. We had the right cause at the right moment for the right purpose. And despite the downturn, we were able to make a compelling case and raise an enormous amount of money. So I think, you know, if your cause is right, you can do this now. But I don't know if that's about getting back to work constructing LACMA. Yeah. I don't know, right? I mean, what are your feelings about that? What do you think is happening there?
I think that, you know, somebody's spending a lot of money to cover up an accident.
Okay.
You know, like, I think that, you know, somebody had the bright idea of changing it. He convinced somebody higher up that convinced a whole bunch of people, and they realized that it was a bad idea. They got that person out of there, and now they're saying, okay, let's fix what, you know, this, you know, or let's put a Band-Aid over, you know, what we were trying to do. Because I think I think every design they've put out looked horrible, you know, and then they've recently put out something on Instagram, like, you know, kind of, I guess this is their form of engagement. Choose which design you think looks best. And then they're like, what the fuck do you mean? Like, it's been 3 years and like 100 and something million, you know, you guys are now trying to reach out to the public to choose a design. You know, that just blows my mind. And all of this is like really interesting, and segueing into this this question I have for you too, is like, these contemporary art giants, you know, they're now finding this opportunity to, you know, seek blood because they're getting larger. They're now partnering with other smaller spaces and becoming even larger spaces, you know, like Hauser and Wirth here in LA. You know, as you know, they have a whole, you know, museum space with tons of galleries, a restaurant, parking, and everything else. You know, and it's, you know, just, you know, a matter of time before, you know, a lot of other you know, spaces get it too. So do you see that becoming a trend where, you know, bigger galleries just start to swallow up museum folks to come work for them and start to build up in a museum structure?
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I think it's really tough. I think it's a very tough thing to get a read on right now, right? Because I think also what would have been lovely is I think a lot of people were looking at the Broad as like a new model of like, you know, how does a private institution and a sort of private and public partnership and blah, 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 and blah, 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 blah. But like, you know, as the proverbial whatever is about to hit the fan, right? All of a sudden, this like billionaire, and like, again, like when you start looking at these things that like, you know, the difference between $1 million and $1 billion is nearly inconceivable, right? I mean, by the time you have lots of billions of dollars, there's so much money there. And the whole idea that, you know, that they would really work to lay off that frontline staff which was actually the thing that they were bragging about the most as an organization, was how successful they were in visitation, their emphasis on customer service, and their engagement of the local artist community, right, to be doing this work. And I think it's important. This is what I was starting to get at a little bit when people think about their businesses, right? That like when you think about your business, your most important thing is actually your talent, right? And so, you know, to see organizations like that decide that they're going to be laying off their frontline staff, it's an interesting question or discussion in terms of, you know, how do some of these like private museums, as you were hinting toward and stuff, continue to move forward. There are a bunch of them in the Miami area now and stuff. And you know, what happens with those spaces? Typically, they're much lower in their staffing, right? We saw this with the opening of the Machino, or how you properly pronounce it, collection, which was, it kind of felt like it was a nightmare. A lot of people really sort of
the Marciano.
Marciano, that's what I was looking for.
I think it had kicked us off. We were right in the middle of everything, so I'm gonna start it back up and get James back in a second. It was getting too good. We couldn't have that kick off like that, so we're gonna start back up and get James back in. So I guess this is part 2 of the conversation for everybody that missed, you know, the last one. It's been going crazy. We were on for an hour and they kicked us off, so I'm starting it back up. I'm waiting for James to come back in. But I think that other conversation on there was on there. All right, here's James. So we coming back in to load up. Let's see. Let's see where you at. Thank you to everybody that was joining us. Thank you for everybody that's still here. If you have any questions, you can still put them down in that little thing. Hey, he's back. He's back. So,
right on. So, but the questions of mega galleries is something else altogether, right? Because also when SF MoMA got built up, not immediately, but not long afterward, you know, Gagosian took a space in San Francisco. Like there used to be, you know, what's happening in terms of like, you know, the mega galleries and where they're going and what they're doing, Hauser and Wirth. You know, I don't get to spend as much time in New York as I might like to, but my understanding is right that Pace has just built a whole damn building, right, with this like extra floor that's just designed for like immersive spaces, because they've recently taken on this like super hip Japanese group that's creating these like fully engaged, you know, all of these kinds of pieces and stuff. And so I don't know where this is going to go, and I think it's difficult to judge because you know, I think that while we might like to imagine that like the Glimcher family is sort of too big to fail, Larry Gagosian is just too well connected, but I think in the next couple weeks, we're going to see Neiman Marcus go out of business. We're going to see the Gap go out of business. A lot of people are saying we will never have malls again any longer at all, because as a construct related to rent, the way the retail is managed, that they will just die, and we just won't have them any longer after the next 3 to 4 months. So what happens to mega galleries? I don't know. I don't know. And you know, but there was this beautiful piece, right, that we were trading about with what's her name, Magda, the lady who created Postmasters.
Magda Soman from Postmasters. Yes.
And then there was also this other just awesome post by Paula Cooper, who was just like, look, I stay small, I stay nimble, I make sure my artists remain fed, I let people go when they want to go, I bring in new people when I think they're great, and I just keep my business going, right? And I think that's a lot of what's going to continue. Not too long ago, I finished this, I know some people have mixed opinions about him, but I'm a big fan of Michael Eric Dyson.
Yes.
And he wrote this terrific book about Jay-Z, amongst a lot of other things.
I listened to the audio book. Yeah, I loved it. It was a very dope book. Very
right.
Dope
and
book.
What's his thing? What's his thing he takes to the next level for me is the hustle.
The hustle. Yeah, he talks about and one thing I like about Michael Eric Dyson is that he elaborates on the hustle in the lyrics. He talks about the poetry, but he also talks about why that's poetic. You know what I mean? And that goes back to those stories again. You know what I mean? Those stories that are encompassed inside of a brushstroke, you know, just like they're inside of a Jay-Z lyric, you know, they're inside of, you know, where they got the material from, you know, how they had to struggle just to buy paint. Those stories are housed in these locations. You know, can a contemporary art major gallery, can Gagosian maintain those stories? or do they just become for sale? Do they become baseball cards?
Right.
You know what I mean?
And so, right. And so with that, I mean, I think that's part of the challenge. It's got to be about the hustle. But for me, it's always been about the hustle.
Yep.
I mean, that's how I got into this business.
Yeah.
That's what I do. It's all about who you know, and I made sure that like early on, I got my art history training. I knew what I needed to do.
Yeah.
I was able to sort of, carry on the conversations that needed to be had. I travel around. I try and get to fairs when I can. But, it's coming from a place where it's like, it's paycheck to paycheck. It's project to project. Like I'm doing the next thing. I'm doing the next thing. I watch you do it, man. Wow. And that's what Arnie Glimcher has been doing ever since he set up Pace. And that's what he's teaching his son to do. Right. So if you've got the hustle, whether it's in the for-profit or nonprofit, that's where you really need to hunker down. What worries me a little bit is I feel like, over the last 10 to 20 years or so, we moved even further to like professionalize the museum industry, most especially also including like the creation of museum studies programs and otherwise. And I think a lot of people expected that with that kind of work, there would like always be an industry to support them, right? Because they were trained in a professional program, and this is how they did it, and this is how it moved forward. But in a lot of ways, that's not really what defines the industry, right? And I got into this because I hustled, and I watch a lot of people hustle. I watch you hustle, and those people are going to make it, right? Because those are the people who are just, at the kitchen table, cutting away, making cards, making calls, making connections. And it matters to them down in their heart of hearts. They'd rather die than not be doing work.
Exactly.
And it's that inspires, again, and I'd encourage everybody to dig in a little bit to that Michael Eric Dyson as he tries to sort of drop the knowledge on like what the hustle means and how Jay-Z exemplifies that, which is also not to say that it's always a good thing. It's about the oppression of the American system and how certain people, especially those who come from a slave tradition, know how to navigate and manage through it. And indeed, same is the case for immigrant populations. I mean, my background as, sort of, I guess it's second generation English, second and third generation Polish, right? These are immigrant families. On my mother's side, right, the only way they did it was as non-Jewish people, they called every Jew they knew in LA and somehow figured out how they got out of London during the Blitz. Like it's all about the hustle.
Yep. So talking about the hustle, how should today's artists, from your perspective, see the museum in their hustle? How should they see the museum going forward? Is it there to support them, or is it something that maybe they should look at as a secondary option?
I think it's just got to be part of the equation. And I think the main thing is actually, exactly as you're saying, what we have in this space, right? Instagram Live, Instagram sharing, all of these things, Etsy, selling through all of these platforms and otherwise, right? Like, there better be a good reason that you want to be getting involved with a museum, and you may not have to, right? But at the same time, a lot of the definitions of what's happening in museums is changing too, right? I mean, there's been a lot of sort of ink spilled in a way, talking about Jordan Castile getting this major retrospective at the new museum as young as she is, right? But you see those paintings and, oh my God, I mean, they're just so great, right? So here is a young woman of color, right? Who's being shown with a major retrospective at the new museum, right? But no, if you follow her on Instagram, you're also going to see that I think it was just yesterday or whatever it was, somebody in the New York Times, I think it was, did a quick little write-up and said, of course, the work of Jordan Castile. She's the woman who did the Obama portrait. And like, what? That's Amy Sherrill. People get their act together, right? So like, as soon as people are starting to figure it out and get it together, people make crazy mistakes like that really reveal that there is a kind of tokenism to the approach of the inclusion of those artists, which is a horrible thing. So I hope that's all okay to say. I'm not quite sure where I was springboarding off of that, but I think, it's related to, if you want the museum, then have the museum, but you don't need the museum, and the museum needs artists more than artists need museum, in a sense. And in many ways, that's really sort of the fundamental message. And with that, that's why museums really need to make sure that they center the work of both living as well as dead artists. Because I think there are tendencies to move away from that. But indeed, it's in terms of art museums, that's what the public wants to commune with. Those are the people that they want to treat as heroes. Those are the stories they want to hear. You know, they want to know that Titian died of the plague in the late 16th century.
Yes. Like, so one of my final questions, I know you got to get going and I got to start to, you know, get back into, you know, the Ramadan, you know, efforts of reading and all of that. But, you know, with the future of museums looking uncertain, do you think that museum professionals have an ability to, I guess, consult with these primary galleries and kind of like guide the not only just the larger ones but the smaller ones, and engaging with trying to help build relationships, or you know, possibly figure out how they could, you know, position themselves to be seen by museum folk, to have their, you know, artists seen by museums, or, you know, what could museum professionals and primary artists and galleries do to kind of, I guess, since the term is flatten the curve now, but, you know, flatten that curve with each other, to have more of a dialogue, to where I don't want to say the right things are collected, but more of an opportunity for things to be collected?
You know, I think it's a really important question, and I think you know what I think it takes is, I think it takes people like you, people like me, asking these kinds of questions.
Yes.
You know, my background is in fundraising, right? So in a lot of ways, I view a certain kind of necessity for people to be somewhat opportunistic in the work that they're doing. I think there are a lot of people on the content side, curators and otherwise, where there's a lot of a effort to actually try and push away from that, to really have a feeling that, you know, art is long and life is short, and we are here as curators and caretakers of the legacies of other artists who used to be, and our need to maintain that at all costs. And typically that means that it needs to remain completely free of any commercial intrusion and those kinds of things. So that with that, art gallery dealers are often not allowed on museum boards. Again, it's not a law, but it just has to do with this kind of like code of ethics, with the idea that maybe, as you're suggesting, which I hadn't really thought about, but they may be able to, like, you know, prioritize their inclusion of their artists and otherwise. From my perspective, I think we're seeing a breaking down of all of those kinds of things. And I think we're only going to see more of it over time. I mean, and really, you know, the more that you, so again, to think about MoAD as an example, MoAD right now is doing an auction online that will be helping artists, that's increasing the profile of artists of color. And it's being done also, I think one of the original suggestions for it came from the gallerist Marian Ibrahim, who said, you know, I have some artists who I think could participate. Clearly, Karen Jenkins Johnson in San Francisco has been playing
She's great.
A very supportive role in this, right? Along with the curatorial team at the museum. I think we all need to be looking at doing more of those kinds of things. And I also kind of feel like, you know, in some of our institutions where we say we don't, it's not exactly true. And it's really done by way of a sort of different kind of trading of favors. It's undeniable that the manner in which certain gallerists in the early part of the 20th century are managing collections, right? I mean, to think about the relationship between gallerists and, say, like the creation of the Barnes collection, and albeit he was a like sort of independent thinker, but Barnes's relationship was very much with the gallerists along with the artists that he got to meet. And all of those kinds of things are I think built into the whole system. And I think we really need to be looking at, exactly as you're encouraging, how can we continue to keep looking at a kind of sort of breaking down of some of those barriers to help make that possible. And indeed, again, I'd look at the Perez. You know, I think Franklin does an incredible job navigating the various and different kind of relationships, as well as making sure that we really think about the community impact of the work that we're doing and how it's being collected. And then also with that, making sure that there's an institutional, you know, a deep set endorsement in investing in how this needs to be happening in terms of the engaging of more artists, more directly, and more artists of color, and understanding this is going to be expensive. You can't do this cheaply, right? And they do a big annual fundraiser and a couple of other things. They manage some special friends group just about making sure that more artists of color are entering the collection of the Perez Museum of Art in Miami.
That's dope. Like, that's so dope. Wow.
Right?
Well, thank you so much, James, brother. I truly appreciate it, as always. Like, I truly appreciate the conversations we have, and folks, you know, seem like they enjoyed it as well. We've had a lot of good comments and things like that here. If you guys, you know, please follow James. He's got a lot of dope stuff going on, always cool stuff. He's a great person. As you see, he's very knowledgeable. Same with me. If you have any questions for anything, this will be put up. I'll send it to James first so we can all look at it, and then it'll be available for folks to see as well. But yeah, any last words, James? Any good things?
Yeah, so thanks. I'll also, when you make this available for viewing afterward, I'll also go back through and figure out some kind of way to post a bunch of links. There's incredible writing going on right now about why museums, how museums, and more museums, and it's so smart, and it's well worth trying to get into one place and moving through those. And I'll make sure that those all get up and get available. I wish I had a mask to put on, but I am all alone, you know, in my backyard.
I'm just in my room, just chilling out, you know, and I've been just relaxing. Like now I'm gonna go back and take another nap and just then do some reading and just take it easy, you know, pretty much.
I hear you, but we just gotta, for everybody, get those masks on, right? I mean, I walk around in my neighborhood, I got my mask on. Every time I see people, and there's so many people not wearing masks. You know, we got people here. I came on the line from Ghana. Folks in Africa, on the continent, take care of yourselves. Wear your masks. You know, be real careful about everything you do, because the rest of the world is going to come around and start running tests and throwing things your way that's going to be real negative.
Yeah, it's going to be terrible. So, well.
So, right on. Thanks for being on the line, Ghana.
Thank you so much, James. Thank you so much to everybody for being on the line. And Brother James, again, I can't thank you enough, man. Can't thank you enough. Be safe. And just my line is always open to you, brother, always.
Appreciate it. Ramadan Mubarak, man. Good luck this evening. Study well. You know, take good care. I'll see you online.
See you soon, brother. See you soon.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.